Where do villains come from?
People aren't naturally born wicked or vile, but humanity spawns from innocence. That innocence is slowly stripped away as the toils of life beat them down. It's something that is learned over time, a mix of ideas and notions that forms and pushes one down a descent into darkness. One bad decision has the power to change the course of one's life forever. After spending 4 years in a Siberian prison, Fyodor Dostoevsky had a new outlook on life, one that drove him to conceive the critically acclaimed novel Crime and Punishment. George Gibbon writes, he set himself the task of exposing the evils of rationalism by presenting a laboratory case of an individual who followed its precepts and pushed them to their logical conclusion. By working out what would happen to that man, Dostoevsky intended to show how destructive the end was for individuals, nations, and mankind. For to him, the fates of the individual and the nation were inseparably interlocked. At its core, Crime and Punishment is an examination through the human mind and the very crimes that man is capable of committing if only pushed enough to do so. Here lies an account of one dreadful fellow, and ultimately his spiral into madness. It all started with the simple notion that then corrupted all thought, until finally action had to be taken. Our tragic tale begins in July, 1860s, St. Petersburg, Russia. On an exceptionally hot day, the man in question, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, a young former student plagued with debt to his landlady, whom he had been avoiding. His mentality had long been deteriorating, verging on hypochondria. Absorbed in his own mind, he lived a life of isolation. So much that the very thought of meeting with anyone filled him greatly with fear. An intellectual with narcissistic tendencies he was. Crime and Punishment deals heavily with themes of rationalism, alienation, and social class. The human condition is made up of a mix of emotion, thought, religion, societal pressures, among other things. So dissatisfied with life, could one be pushed to commit extreme acts of malice? Suffering is inherently a part of life, but it's how one responds to suffering that makes or breaks an individual. It's the response that turns an ordinary individual into a cold-blooded killer. Imprisoned to a society that delves heavily with favoritism, Raskolnikov decides to take matters into his own hands. Enacting his free will, he devises a plan to end his suffering. Stuck in a cycle of poverty that he so desperately wants to overcome, he decides to eliminate the main force pushing him into debt and unhappiness, his landlady. Dostoevsky further develops themes of morality and philosophy through his characters, carefully painting a picture of 19th century Russia, a world built on the backs of laborers. The cycle of debt and poverty is endless and inescapable. Throughout the novel, the reader is introduced to an assortment of characters, each dealing with their own mortal turmoils, but each reacts differently. One man turns to alcohol to temporarily fix his ailments, another falls to a marriage of class. Each person finds a way of dealing with their suffering. Raskolnikov turns to murder. He believes the human race is divided into the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary must live in obedience and do not have the right to break the law because they're ordinary. The extraordinary, on the other hand, have the right to commit all sorts of crimes and break the law in all sorts of ways precisely because they're extraordinary, as stated in Part 3, Chapter 5 of the novel. Under the delusion that he is an extraordinary individual who is above the law of man, comparably to the great General Napoleon, he takes up his axe and marches up to his landlady's apartment. What drives criminality? Ultimately, Raskolnikov is imprisoned in the class and society he lives in, plagued with aspirations of greatness, a desire to be extraordinary. He slowly ascends the stairs of the apartment. For a moment he doubts, but then comes to believe that it is fate who brought him to this place. He takes up the task of bringing justice to an unjust community as he sees fit. With blood on his hands, he frantically flees the scene of the crime. Once done, it is done for good. It's one thing to think about crime, but once that idea leaves the mind and enters the realm of reality, there's no turning back. Infested with paranoia, fear, anxiety, sickness, and terror, the walls begin to close in on him. At any given moment, he could confess it all. The overbearing weight of guilt crushes him as he comes to realize the consequences of his actions. He has rationalized another human being's life and made the high and mighty decision that the world would be better off without. Acting as the higher being he has no right to be. Raskolnikov is forced to face himself, his true self, and a cat-and-mouse chase begins between the police officer and Raskolnikov. Who will break first? In the end, the real villain of the story is a society who turns its back on the very individuals who maintain it. Raskolnikov is a simple man who made a bad decision under poor circumstances and conditions. He is not an inherently evil person, but rather a flawed individual just like the rest of humanity. He'll have to pay for those actions the rest of his life, and he is forever changed as his perspectives begin to shift. The novel is titled Crime and Punishment, and yet Dostoevsky's story mostly evolves around the psychological punishment one must endure after committing said crimes. Can someone overcome their guilt? Can a criminal truly be redeemed? These are the questions that are wrestled with as the novel concludes. Maybe redemption can come in ways unexpected.